Hi, I'm Len Epp from LeanPub, and in this LeanPub Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Diego Zamboni. Based in Switzerland, Diego is an enterprise security architect at Swisscom, the giant Swiss telecoms company. He has over 27 years of experience in various areas, from self-healing systems to cloud computing, amongst others. Diego is also a popular writer and speaker, and you can read his blog at czamboni.org and follow him on Twitter at czamboni. Diego is the author of two books, Learning CF Engine, Automated System Administration for Sites of Any Size, and his latest book, Learning Hammerspoon, Unleash the Power of Automation on Your Mac. In this interview, we're going to talk about Diego's background and career, his professional interests, his books, and at the end we'll talk a little bit about his experience working with a conventional publisher on his first book and using LeanPub to publish his second book and actually republish his first book. So thank you, Diego, for being on the Front Matter podcast.
Thank you, Len, for the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you first became interested in computers and technology.
Of course, yeah. Actually, I can go on at length about that. Feel free to interrupt me if I go on for too long. I've basically been interested in technology for almost as long as I can remember. My dad is an engineer. He studied electronics engineering, and so he never worked a lot with computers, but he was fascinated by them. So I grew up among issues of Popular Mechanics when it was still a proper technical magazine, Byte magazine, and many other any technical magazine that he could get his hands on. So I got exposure to that from very early on. And I think that helped a lot in developing my own interest for technology. I remember as young as maybe 5 or 6 years old, I remember I was drawing robots and inventing things on paper. Actually, my first computer is one that my dad got for me, which was a Timex Sinclair 1000. If you've ever heard of those, it was the US equivalent of the famous ZX81 in the UK, and it had a fantastic 1 kilobyte of RAM, and that was my proper start in computing. That's when I started learning BASIC. I was about 10 years old at the time. Later, I got a Commodore 64. I started reading almost every computing magazine that I could get my hands on. Some of the early also Commodore magazines like Compute and Compute's Gazette. Whenever I could get them. I grew up in Mexico, so it was not always easy to get U.S. magazines and books there. But as much as I could, I would try to get them, read the programs. I was of the generation of kids who would type programs from magazines into their computers and run games and whatever. And that was my start, actually. Eventually, when I was about 15 years old, I managed to get the program that I wrote published in Compute's Gazette. By the time I had a Commodore 128, and I wrote a program that allowed you to create a catalog of your floppy disks, which was a problem in that era, right? Before hard disks, you would be shuffling floppy disks all the time, and everyone who used a computer had a growing collection of these things. So that was something I wrote to scratch my own itch, as they say, and ultimately turned into my first publication. Then I went on to study computer engineering in college. And that's when I got started in the area of computer security.
And if I just interrupt you there,
yes.
At what university did you study?
I studied at the National University of Mexico, which is
that in Mexico?
Is the largest. It's in Mexico City. It's the largest university in Mexico. It's the national university. At the time I was studying there were something like 300,000 students in the university. So it's a very big university. Many campuses, not only in Mexico City, but all throughout the country. And it covers basically every field of study that you could imagine.
I think you might.
And it was one of the.
I think you might be the first person I've interviewed who can give us an account of what it's like to study at university in Mexico. It's of course, it's different in different countries. Is it I mean, so like I think many people listening will have a sort of more or less a kind of American model in mind where you study for 4 years and you take a variety of classes and you have a major. Is that how it worked for you?
It's basically like that. In there they call them it's like schools, like a school of engineering or school of science. And the path I took was computer engineering. So that's when I took a bunch of course, general classes, like the common set of classes that you have to take in college, but also more specialized classes, not only in computing, but also in electronics, in digital design, computer architecture, data center management, all sorts of miscellaneous various things that try to provide you with a fairly complete picture. It's actually a very good university. And one of the things is that it has a lot of infrastructure. So actually, it was while I was studying in college that I started working at the main the computer center of the university bought a Cray supercomputer, which was back when Cray computer was still in existence and was making these huge, super expensive machines with a lot of processing power, at least by the standards of the time. So they bought a Cray supercomputer, and I was able to get a job in the supercomputer center, first as an intern and then as an employee. And that's when I started working as a Unix system administrator. I started learning Unix. And later, I started getting interested in computer security because someone had to take care of these things. There had been a couple of security incidents, and I found it very interesting. And that's when I started learning about that. And that actually turned into my career, right? Computer security. I went on from there to study a PhD in the US at Purdue University, where I did my PhD in computer science, and my field of specialization was computer security and intrusion detection, which was the topic of my PhD dissertation. I mean, by then I was long hooked into computing. I worked then for a few years at IBM, at the IBM Research Lab in Zurich, in Switzerland. Then,
and if I could just pause you
yes.
there in your story. So, what was it like? I mean, I guess I got two questions. You've moved around a lot, and
yes.
what was it like moving from Mexico to the United States when you, I imagine, moved to Indiana?
I moved to Indiana. Yes, it was. It was an experience. Yeah, as you know, as my PhD advisor sent me an email that I still have before, when I had already been accepted at the university, but before I started, he sent me an email that said, when you go back home, which you eventually will, it will be with a much wider perspective of the world. And this is both a loss and a gain. And this is something that I have found very true, right? As you said, I have moved a lot around in my life. Every place is different. Every place gives you a lot of richness. You learn a lot of things, but you also lose some things. I noticed that basically I don't consider myself a citizen of anywhere in particular because I have lived in so many different parts of the world. My moving started very young. Because I was actually born in Argentina, but I grew up in Mexico. And even within Mexico, my family moved around a lot due to job and school and other things. So as long as I can remember, I've moved around a lot. So for me, going to the U.S. was not such a drastic change. Of course, the many cultural aspects and other things were different. But ultimately, I found it a very interesting experience.
I've got just a personal observation to make, and then I'd like to ask you a little bit more about that. But so I've moved around a fair amount in my life too. You know, when I was a kid, my parents didn't really move a lot, but I ended up going to 6 different schools from kindergarten to grade 12.
Oh wow!
And I moved to the UK in 1999. Moved to London. And thrived there in that country in a way it wasn't possible for me to thrive in Canada for a number of reasons. And I feel the same way. It's about not really. I mean, I think I feel the same way to what you described, where there's not really any particular place where I feel like I really belong. But for me, it's funny that people tend to assume that everybody's the same as they are. And when a lot of people hear that, they think, oh, it must have been terrible to have lost that sense of home. And it's like, I never had that. I actually carry a fair amount of resentment towards the people in the place where I actually grew up. I never fit in there. It was never a home. There was nothing to lose. And that the idea of feeling at home in a certain place is just something that I've never had, and don't miss, and don't, in a sense, don't even. It just seems kind of strange to me. Right. Just sort of culturally speaking, I come from a Mennonite background, and Mennonites are people who don't have any particular connection to a place culturally. So the whole idea of having a particular place that's your home, I get it, wasn't there for me to lose. And it's funny actually how many people there are like that. And when you move around, you tend to meet them.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's exactly like that for me as well. That ultimately for me, home, of course, at the moment, home is where my family is. And home is wherever the people I care for are, right? So it becomes less geographically rooted and more rooted on other things, on what's important to you, on people or on events or on maybe a job or whatever it is for each person. And I think this is, as I said before, this is both a loss and a gain. Because I also see people that have never left, for example, some of my old friends that never left, and for them it's inconceivable to leave, right? Because this is where everything is. And I have met a lot of people who are like this, that they wouldn't even consider leaving where they are, which is something that for me is natural, right?
It's funny you say that. Yeah, I have a friend, an old friend who's a philosopher who has an old study that he can never track down, but he loves to cite all the time, in which people, in the rankings of things that would be a catastrophe in their life, number one is moving, and number two is divorce. People would prefer, in the end, if they had to choose between divorce and moving, they'd choose divorce over moving, and it's a really interesting phenomenon.
Wow.
Yeah. And so you moved to Zurich to be a hotshot at IBM.
Yes.
What was that like, moving to Zurich?
This was. It's interesting because in some ways the culture in Switzerland is more similar to Mexico than the US. For example, in the sense of family, I find that people here tend to be very close to their family, which is the same in Mexico. And it's not so much in the U.S. It depends, of course. This is a very broad generalization, right? But I mean, there are certain little things that I find very familiar. On the other hand, of course, Switzerland is a great country. It's very safe. It's very clean. Everything works. All of the stereotypes that you have heard are true, right?
Yeah, but I can't help myself. My joke about the Swiss is that they're Germans without the sense of humor.
Yes. Yeah, maybe that's one of the things, right? I mean, it can be a bit disconcerting for someone coming from a warmer culture, right? The Swiss are always polite, they're always kind, they're always proper, but it's very hard to get really close in a personal sense to the people. And this is just an aspect of their culture, right? And this can be disconcerting for someone moving in. But ultimately, we lived here for a few years. Then we decided to go back to Mexico, and we ended up coming back to Switzerland. So it's really a nice place, and that's why we're back.
And along the way, you worked for a company called CF Engine.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Of course, yes. So when we moved back to Mexico, I worked for a big very big computer company, whose name I'm not going to mention because of what comes next. And I was working as a consultant. And one of the things that struck me as very, very odd was that a lot of things were still being done by hand, right? That even in very large projects, someone would be there sitting the whole night configuring machines and doing these things over and over and over again by hand. And I have always been very interested in automation from very early on. So I knew about this program called CF Engine, which is basically a configuration management tool. It's the granddaddy, if to say it somehow, of tools like Puppet and Ansible and Chef and other configuration management tools that are very well known now. But CF Engine came out 20 years before any of those. So I started learning about it, and I realized that a new version had just come out, version 3, which was very different from the previous versions. It used a different language for configuration, and there was very little information about it. So I started teaching myself the tool, how to use it, and I thought this was a good opportunity to fulfill a long time dream of mine, which was to write a book. So I started putting together a proposal for a book, and I shopped it around for a little bit, and eventually O'Reilly accepted it. And if you grew up in the 90s as a technical person, the mecca of technical books was and continues to be in many ways O'Reilly. I grew up professionally with O'Reilly books, as did many other people. So for me, getting the book accepted was a very big deal. By then, I'm coming back to your question. I'm not diverting from it. By then, I was participating in the CF Engine community, in the mailing lists and things like this. So I sent an email to Mark Burgess, who is the main author of CF Engine, to tell him, hey, by the way, I thought you should know that I got this book proposal accepted by O'Reilly, so the book will come out in some time. And in return, he offered me a job at the company. So it turns out that CF Engine started as an open source project, which it continues to be, but then he founded a company to sell a commercial version and professional services around CF Engine. And then they offered me a position also as a consultant. And I wasn't completely happy at my current job at the time. So I thought this is a great opportunity. So I came on board. I worked at CF Engine for a few years, got the book published, which was it was a win-win for both sides, right? I mean, I got a lot of support for writing the book by working there, and also the company got a lot of publicity and promotion from having an O'Reilly book published about the product. So that was a very good experience, a very pleasant experience. It was a very, very good team of people, and yeah, that was my experience with CF Engine, which then a few years after, O'Reilly has been shifting some of its priorities. Now they focus a lot more on video content and tutorials and conferences, and not so much in books. They have become much stricter in the books that they publish, because I guess it's a lot of investment. So they decided that they didn't want to publish my book anymore. It's a pretty niche market book, so it wasn't a top seller, I guess. But they were very kind about it, and they agreed to revert the rights of the book back to me, which is when I started publishing it as a self-published book, which eventually brought me to Leanpub.
Yeah, I've got some questions that I'd like to ask you about that specifically. Getting your rights back is actually a kind of hot topic in the self-publishing world. But
yes.
before we move on to that, there are a couple of other things I wanted to talk to you about. One of which is, it was really interesting reading for me to read up about CF Engine and the way it was open source, and it was meant to provide people with a way to automate the management of numerous computing systems and servers at the same time. And as you were saying about the big company that shall not be named, where people were doing things manually, actually a lot of human potential was unleashed with the automation of these networks of computing machines. And so this actually represents a very significant moment in, I guess, the post-industrial era.
Exactly. Actually, this is a very good point, because CF Engine drew a lot of ideas from this. There's an author, and his name is escaping me at the moment. It will come back to me in a moment. But he wrote about the three waves of human evolution. And in fact, if you search for the three waves, you will see the name.
I've got it.
And
it's in the introduction to your book. I'll just open it up.
Exactly. So the three waves are, in the first wave, it's everyone does their own thing, right? And for example, in terms of human society, this is the time of history when people were building their own pots and tools, and they were planting their own food, and they were growing their own animals, right? The second wave is when we have economies of scale, right? When people start specializing, and you no longer grow your plants, you buy them at the market from someone who does this at scale, and in return, you provide some other service. And ultimately, the third wave is the wave in which we are now, in which it's not so much about products, it's more about ideas. And now the really valuable things are the ideas and the processes and the technologies that people invent, right? In the sense of computer system administration, we used to compare CF Engine to the third wave of evolution, because the idea is exactly as you said, that you free the humans that are tending to the systems. You free them from the mundane, repetitive tasks, and you let them focus on higher level thinking, right? So instead of figuring out how to configure a web server so that it behaves in a certain way, you just say, I need 3 web servers and 2 database servers and this and that, and you start thinking at a higher level because their lower levels are automated. And this is a idea, a very powerful idea.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that great explanation and putting it in that high level context, which I think is so important. The author, by the way, is Alvin Toffler.
Yes,
and the books you refer to in your book are Future Shock and The Third Wave.
Exactly.
Actually, so on this topic, so automation is obviously something that is sort of in the news. It has been in the news for, a very long time. I mean, indeed, centuries when it comes to the potential for job losses and things like that. And I just wanted to talk to you for a little bit about that. I mean, my non-experts, news headline reading normal person's view of it is that, people have been worried about automation taking jobs away for a long time. I think my sort of intuition leads me to fall more or less on the side that automation tends to free up people to do other things, and automation gives them it just becomes the new tool that you can do things with. But at the same time, particularly when I think about jobs like driving, like truck driving, and there are, like 3 million truck drivers in the United States, I think. A lot of people like doing jobs that are repetitive and where you kind of learn what you need to do once. And it might be like, I could never drive a truck. Honestly, I think I just couldn't. So I'm not saying these things are easy, but they do come easy to some people. And when they learn them, then they've acquired a skill and they've acquired a trade. And now they want to, turn on the radio and have their hand on the wheel and try and enjoy, trucking in particular is actually a very difficult job in a lot of ways, with time away from family and hard hours and things like that, and mistreatment by management and things like that. But at the same time, there's just a certain kind of activity that I think some people are suited towards, I like to live in my head, and a lot of people like to live in their hands. And so one concern I have when I think about this is that, what if because of what we can now do with machine learning and robotics and things like that, if the pace of change goes in things like self-driving cars, if it continues the way it has in the next 10 years like it has in the past 10 years, it's actually possible that we might end, to go into sort of sci-fi or futurist kind of ways of thinking, we could end up in an age when all those jobs, the category of activity of kind of manual labor becomes there are only very few niches left where it needs to be done. I mean, do you have concerns about that kind of thing when you think about it?
I think my thinking about this is that this has been a concern as long as technology has existed, right? At every stage of human evolution, there have been worries that the new technologies will destroy jobs and will create massive economic problems, for example. This happened when the first machines appeared, and a lot of human things that people used to do with their hands started being done by machines or by tools, right? This happened again first with human-powered machines, then with engine-powered machines, then with computers, now with faster computers and more automation and AI. What I think is that we people will always find things to do with our time. And there will always be things that people can do to develop their interests and their passion, right? Coming back to the example that you just mentioned, what if, and maybe this is simplistic thinking maybe, but what if instead of, if you like driving and if you like the feeling of this, what if you could do it just for fun and not because you have to do it 12 hours a day and suffer mistreatment by management and long hours away from home, and you can just do it when you feel like it and as you want it, right? On the other hand, I think we are very far away from fully automating a lot of these jobs. As much progress as we have made, I think it's still a bit far away. So I think we still have time to think about this, but my feeling tells me that there will always be other interesting things to do with our time and with our interests and with our abilities, despite the progress of automation. And there will be certain things that machines, I'm pretty confident, will never be able to do, right? Creative thinking, these kind of things will be very hard or impossible ever to automate. So I think there will always be room for humans in everything we do.
Thanks very much for sharing that. That's a very optimistic answer, and I hope you're right. So we've been talking about some big serious things, and not that I want to make light of it, but your latest book on LeanPub is about automating tasks on your Mac to make it more fun to use your Mac, using something called Hammerspoon, and I really enjoyed getting into it. And just to set the stage, using this I'll call it a tool, Hammerspoon, you can do things like set it up so if you select some text in, say, German, then you can use a sort of short keyboard shortcut you've set up and have something pop up with a translation in English. That's just one example. And so before we go on, so can I use Hammerspoon? I've got sort of various habits, and I haven't looked very hard, I confess, but that I haven't found a way of automating, which are at various times of day or at various times of week, I like to change sort of the background image on my Mac. So I've got a particular image for the weekend. I've got one for when I'm working during the day, and then one for when I've turned off work and now I'm using my computer for other things at night. Can I use Hammerspoon to do that?
Yes, absolutely.
Fantastic.
Basically, Hammerspoon allows you to automate almost everything that you have on your Mac. I should mention it's a Mac-specific tool, but it has very deep integration. So you can definitely have things based on time of day, on location, for example, I have a few applications that need to be reconfigured when I come from the office, when I come to the office or leave the office, because they need to reconfigure their proxy for use in the office network. So I have some conditions that trigger when there's a change in the wireless network to which my machine is connected, so that when I leave the office and I come home, it detects this change and it automatically reconfigures these applications. That's amazing. This is something that, for example, you can also have it triggered based on time of day, on day of the week, even on location. Hammerspoon can get geographical information And maybe you can have it set that when you're at home or when you are at the airport or when you are at the office, you have different sets of things happen. It's really it's a super powerful application, and I really like it.
Yeah, that's amazing. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how it actually works under the hood, and then maybe explain then how, as a user, you would set up a task or a set of things.
Of course. First of all, I'd like to comment on something you said at the very beginning, which is sort of the lighter side of things. And the fact is that I love technology. I've always loved technology. And as I have progressed in my professional career, my job is less and less technical, right? It's more about planning. It's more about design. It's more about architecture and things like this. But I have never been able to subtract myself from actually tinkering with machines and playing with technology directly, which is why outside of work, I keep coding, I keep programming, and that's why I ended up writing this book. So basically, Hammerspoon has it's a Mac application which has integrations into a lot of the subsystems that compose the macOS operating system. So it has integrations into the UI events, it has integrations into the file system, it has integrations into the sound system, the networking system, and a bunch of other things. And all of these integrations are exposed through Lua, which is a scripting language, which was developed from the beginning as an embeddable scripting language, which means that it has facilities built into the language and the framework that make it very easy to integrate into other applications. So Lua, for example, is very commonly used in video games. A lot of new video games that allow you to program things into them use Lua as their scripting language. So Hammerspoon also uses Lua, and through Lua you can basically just write commands. So, for example, there's a Hammerspoon library which is called hs.window. And through this library, you can manipulate the windows on your machine. So you can find which windows are on the screen at the moment, which ones belong to different applications, and you can also manipulate them. So you can, for example, change their size, change their position, move them back and forth with respect to one another. So this is something that I use very often with shortcuts on my keyboard. I can make one window take only half of the screen and then the other take the other half of the screen. Or when I'm connected to my external monitor in the office, I can move windows from one screen to the other using my keyboard. And all of this is done basically by writing code. So Hammerspoon is an automation tool which is very suited towards programmers because you need to do at least a bit of programming to set it up the way you want it. Hammerspoon also has libraries called spoons, which make it easier to use it without so much coding. So spoons are modules that allow you to basically just load them and use them for different tasks. And there's a lot of spoons that have been contributed by people in the community for everything from window manipulation to integration with smart light bulbs at home or sound systems or all sorts of things that you can just load, tell it what you need to do, and then use it without having to worry too much about how it works. But if you know how to program a little bit, you can have a tremendous amount of control over the things that happen on your Mac.
That's amazing. Thanks very much for that very clear description. I'm looking forward to trying to figure out a little bit of this myself because there are some. The reason it exists is because there are some things that we do all the time, and that description, that example you have of when you're switching Wi-Fi networks or going from one place to another and having just the settings all happen automatically is just sounds like magic.
Exactly, it is like magic, and it often happens that we get used to doing these repetitive tasks. Like it's, for example, this example you mentioned before with the translation. Particularly because I live in a German-speaking country and I speak a bit of German, but not very fluently yet. So all the time I was selecting some text, copying it, going to Google Translate, pasting it, And ultimately, I realized this was something I could automate. And one of the objects in this case, I can give you a concrete example. Hammerspoon has integration into the clipboard subsystem, so I can see which text is selected or copied into the clipboard. And on the other hand, it allows me to open a browser window that I can point at a specific URL. And by connecting these two, I can basically have a hotkey that copies the currently selected text, opens a browser window that goes to Google Translate, puts the selected text there, and automatically does the translation. And it saves me a lot of time every day.
Yeah, that's just amazing. And so just moving on to the third part and last part of the interview, where we talk about the interviewee's experiences as an author and a self-published author. So you've had an interesting journey there. So you talked a little bit already about your experience with O'Reilly. You mentioned shopping around your idea. I was wondering if you could, it's funny because to people who are sort of familiar with what these things mean, that's very obvious. But to people who are on the other side of it and who are like, I'd really like to be an author myself, even if they're maybe a little bit familiar with what that means. So, okay, obviously from the context, that means approaching publishers with an idea. How did you go about doing that? Did you send emails? Did you have, a business plan?
Not really. I did it a bit empirically. Actually, my first approach was to a publisher called Pragmatic Programmers, who also publish technical books. They have a set of very nice books. And the reason I approached them first was because they organized at the time something that they called the Pragmatic Programmers Writing Month, which is equivalent, if you heard of it, of the novel, what is it? The
NaNoWriMo.
NaNoWriMo, right? The month during which you are encouraged, you can sign up and you have to write 50,000 words or something and to get a jump start on your book. So basically they organized something like this at the same time as NaNoWriMo, but for technical books. So they were encouraging people to sign up to write a certain amount of text every day. And basically by doing this for a full month, jump-starting their technical book. So I signed up with my idea for the CF Engine book, and I did it. I wrote every day. I put together an outline and I started filling it in. And by the end, I had 1 or 2 chapters pretty full of content, I thought. And then I submitted my proposal to them, to Pragmatic Programmers, and they didn't want to take it because they were working on a similar book at the time, and they felt there was a lot of overlap between that and my proposal. So then my next try was O'Reilly, but O'Reilly as a very popular publisher, my guess is that they received and probably continue to receive a lot of proposals from different people. So their guidelines for potential authors try to discourage you as much as possible. They say things like, "Oh, you really need to think carefully before doing this. We have a very strict process, and it's a very low percentage of people who get accepted," which I think makes sense. They try to filter out the people who would just randomly submit something. So, but still, it was a dream of mine to have an O'Reilly book. So I sent them my proposal, and they liked it. So actually, maybe shopping around was a bit of an exaggeration. I only submitted it to 2 places, and the second one accepted it. But yeah, ultimately, it was an I think it was an extraordinary experience to work with O'Reilly. And as I wrote somewhere, after working with them, I realized why their books are so good or were so good, right? Because the whole process, the whole editorial process, I think this is what a good book publisher gets you, and which is, of course, harder to get as a self-published author, right? You get an editor that basically walks along you through the whole process, and he asks you questions, and he tells you, hey, this is not very clear, or what could we do here? He tries to learn about what you're writing, and he really gets engaged. I was very lucky to have an editor like this. And this was for me an eye-opening experience, that I realized writing a book is much more than just putting the words on paper, right? It's about structuring your ideas and really a lot of hard work in motivating yourself. And of course, here having a good editor also helps a lot, because he pushes you a little bit to continue working.
Yeah, it's really interesting, having talked to quite a few people in interviews for this podcast about it, how some people react to the experience of working with a conventional publisher and having an editor, and how other people react. And of course, it depends on who the publisher is and who they work with within that publisher and stuff like that. But there are some people who are just like, the last thing I want is some editor looking over my shoulder, telling me what to do with my book. But then there are other people for whom that's exactly what they want. And then it's also project specific, right? There might be just a certain kind of project where you're like, this book absolutely needs to have a professional editor involved in its production. And then there are other ones where, it just doesn't. There's no need for that, or it would slow me down and I want to get this out right away or something like that. And so you mentioned you went through the experience of getting your rights back for the book. How did that work?
Actually, this happened pretty naturally, and in fact, the initiative came from them. The thing was that I published the initial release of the book, then I did an update a few months later, and another one a few months later, and then there was a fairly long period of time during which I didn't have a lot of time to work on the book, so there was no updates for a while, and when I started thinking about updating it again, my editor came back to me and said, we are doing a bit of a cleanup in the catalog. We are focusing only on the high value books, and so we have decided that your book, we're no longer interested in publishing your book. We will continue selling it as much as, particularly the electronic version of the book. In fact, the original version of my book is still available in Safari Books Online, which is the online catalog that O'Reilly keeps. And but then he said, then I asked him, okay, so what happens now, right? Is the book dead, or can I continue writing it? And he says, well, we could release new versions, but we wouldn't be able to do the whole editorial process of do the review and the typesetting and all of this. You would have to do this on your own. And then I suggested, well, would it be possible to get the rights of the book back to me so that I can publish it on my own or through some other publisher? And he said, okay, let me check on that. And they said yes. Basically, it was fairly painless. Then they sent me a letter saying that by this letter, we acknowledge that the book's rights are assigned back to you, and you can do whatever you want. With some conditions like removing branding and graphics and things like this from the book. And that was it. Basically, that was it. As soon as I got this confirmation, I took the PDF almost as I had it and published it on my own on Amazon. But it was some time after that I started looking around at places where I could do the self-publishing in a more elegant fashion, and that's when I found LeanPub, and that was it.
I've got a question about that. So this is very kind of in the weeds, but to people who face this challenge, hearing about someone's experience doing it would probably be extremely helpful. So you had a written manuscript for the book, and then you wanted to publish it on LeanPub, and to do that, we have a bring your own book feature, which is, our workflow, which is upload your PDF, and that's amazing. Yes. And then you can use all of LeanPub's 80% royalty rate and coupons and all that bundling and all that kind of great stuff. But you can also, if you want to, convert your manuscript to LeanPub flavored markdown or Markua, which are our in-house markup syntaxes for publishing books. And Markua, of course, is the one we recommend to everyone going forward. And so how did you go about taking your manuscript and putting it into Markua? Was that a laborious process, or was it just a matter of like putting, number sign in front of your chapter titles?
It was a bit laborious, but I think I was also lucky. So the native format that was used for my book at O'Reilly was DocBook, which is an XML-based format. It's like any XML format. It's very verbose. It's very, very structured. But I was lucky that sometime before, O'Reilly also started using another format called AsciiDoc. And they did the initial conversion of my book to AsciiDoc for me, because I was still publishing the book with them. So by the time I got the rights of the book assigned to me, I had my manuscript in AsciiDoc format, which is a text-based format similar to Markdown or Markua, but with some different conventions, right? So I was able to fairly easily convert my files from AsciiDoc to Markdown by using available tools like Pandoc. And that allowed me to basically just publish the book almost right away with LeanPub. It was fairly painless. It required still some manual intervention because there were some sections of the book that even within the AsciiDoc file were formatted using HTML because they had some very specialized placement or colors or alignments or things like this. So those parts I still had to convert by hand. But overall, it was a fairly painless experience. I think we are lucky to now be in a time where very powerful conversion tools are available. For example, Pandoc alone probably can take care of 80% of the format conversion needs for most documents. And I had to do a bit of tricks because, for example, AsciiDoc is not very well supported by Pandoc yet. So I had to use some other tools. I also had to do some manual scripting to transform certain aspects of the book. But overall, I was very happy with it. Now, the next step, which I should probably mention, is that I converted my book from Markdown to org mode. I don't know if you're familiar with org mode. It's a markup format which was developed in the Emacs world, the Emacs editor, and it's a very powerful format from which you can export a lot of other different formats. So eventually I converted my whole book to org mode. And from there, I was generating Markdown, LeanPub flavored Markdown. But now I started using Markua. And the nice thing is that my source text, the one I edit, continues to be in org mode. And I'm just now exporting it in a different format. And this is a very powerful combination.
Well, fantastic. Thank you very much for going into the details. That kind of thing is gold to authors
Yes.
who are facing those challenges themselves to hear about those processes.
And I should just to complete the thought, I should mention that if anyone is interested, I like to write about this thing. So I have quite a few posts in my blog about the tools and the configurations and the processes that I use for this. So if any of our listeners is interested, they can probably find some good information there.
Yeah, and I should say we actively invite authors to, if they can write anything about their LeanPub process, and they write posts about them, we link to them in our help center, and we'll post them in our author forum and things like that. So we love hearing about that kind of stuff ourselves as well. So the last question I always like to ask people on the podcast is if there's anything you can think of that you would ask us to build and we would do it for you, or anything you would ask us to fix and we would fix it for you. Can you think of anything you would ask for?
Of course. So first, I would like to say a couple of things that I would like you not to change. Okay. And one of them is the approachability of you, of Peter, of everyone at LeanPub, because it's not common to get direct answers from the founders or the co-founders of a company when you ask a support question. And I think this level of direct involvement and access is fantastic. Asking a question and then getting it fixed right away, or getting direct information from the people who are building the product. This is extremely valuable and I have found it very, very nice in dealing with you guys. I was, in terms of things that I would ask for, I think my main one would be to just finish the Markua implementation, because the spec is there. It's very nice. It's very powerful, but there are quite a few things that are still not supported or not implemented. So to me, this would be very nice, particularly for things like indexing, for example. Maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I still like books that have an index. And my book has all of the indexing markup in there, which is at the moment non-functional. But if I could generate an index from it, that would be very nice. And there are a few other things that I still find every once in a while that are not properly or fully implemented. And this would be my main request.
Well,
Yeah,
well, thanks very much for that. With respect to Markua, this is something that we made a strategic decision to really focus on finishing it, finishing the implementation of it. And so that is something that we are actively working on, and we are going to be ecstatic when it's fully implemented. It's been a long process, but I mean, the vision is there, and our authors like you can see it, we can see it, and we're very much looking forward to the day when it's finished and when its implementation is finished, and we are actively focusing on that to the exclusion of other things.
That's very nice to hear.
And when it comes to the sort of direct touch, thank you very much for talking about that as well. It is really important to us to have that direct contact with authors and customers. It does involve a fair amount of, saying the same thing over and over again to some extent, but that's part of the job. But what it does mean is, the approach that I take to every interaction I have with an author or, a reader is what systemic issue does this represent? There's the human factor, which actually there is a lot you can do about that, with nudging and recommendations and design and things like that. But in particular as well, I think, I maybe am a little bit romantic about it, but, not all services you interact with are services where you're going to be spending hundreds of hours on a project that might be very important to you, if you know what I mean. And so when you're working with people who are writing, writing has a fair amount of marketing about it. LeanPub encourages people to do in-progress publishing, which means basically every time you update with a new chapter, it's a little new book launch. And,
yes.
If someone is sitting there and they've been like, and people don't necessarily tell us, and you don't, of course you don't have to, everything should just work. But, if you've been putting time and even money into marketing the launch of the next phase of your book, and you hit the publish button and the book generation fails, and it's 11 p.m. on Friday, Pacific time, and, if we see that, I might have had too many beers to answer or whatever. But if, if I see it, or Peter sees it and someone's in trouble, it's not the same thing as like, something trivial not working. It's a big deal, and writing a book is a huge investment. And so having that kind of as much direct contact as is useful for authors and for us to have, because there's matters of scale and where your attention is going and how you're using your attention and time responsibly that factor into everything. But that kind of direct contact is actually very important to us as on our side as well in a lot of ways, and it's one of the reasons we choose to do business that way.
Yeah, and I can tell you as an author, it's really valuable. It's something that really, really makes you, I think, loyal as an author to know that people care about your book.
Well, thank you for saying that. We don't hear that all the time. It's nice to hear that what we believe is true. So thank you very much, Diego, for taking the time out of your evening in Switzerland to talk to me here. And thank you very much for being a LeanPub author.
Thank you, Len. Thank you again for the opportunity. It was I really enjoyed talking to you, and I hope we will do this sometime again.
Yes, thank you very much. And as always, thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the Front Matter podcast. If you like what you heard, please rate and review it wherever you found it, especially on iTunes. It really does help. And if you would like to be a LeanPub author, creating either a book or a course, please go to our website at leanpub.com. Thanks.